The wind carried more dust than hope across Sarah Collins' lonely Colorado ranch that spring morning. We can almost hear the empty grain bin creaking in the breeze and feel the quiet worry pressing against every weathered board of the little farmhouse. Inside, a widow stood over a small iron pot, stirring what would be the last bowl of stew she could make until Providence sent another answer. 7-year-old Noah watched from the table, trying to smile, even though his growing stomach had forgotten what a full meal felt like. Before we continue this journey together, if stories of compassion, courage, and the enduring spirit of the American frontier speak to your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Together, we'll keep these timeless Western tales alive, one unforgettable story at a time. Sarah tasted the stew and forced herself to nod. It was thin, mostly broth, a few potatoes, and the final scraps of dried venison her late husband had stored before the cruel winter claimed his life. It wasn't much, but it was everything she had. She carried the bowl to Noah and brushed a hand through his sandy hair. "Eat while it's warm," she whispered. "Aren't you eating too, Mama?" the boy asked. Sarah smiled the way only mothers can when they are hiding hunger behind love. "I'll eat later." Noah looked at the pot and knew better. He had grown old enough to recognize sacrifice, even if he didn't yet understand all its weight. Just then, 3 soft knocks echoed against the front door. Sarah frowned. Visitors rarely found their way to this isolated valley, especially in difficult times. Wiping her hands on her worn brown apron, she opened the door. An elderly cowboy stood on the porch. Dust covered his faded trail coat. His black hat had seen decades beneath mountain suns. A silver beard framed a tired face lined by countless cattle drives, and an old pair of saddlebags rested across one shoulder. He looked as though every mile in the West had passed beneath his boots. He removed his hat with quiet respect. "Ma'am," he said gently, "would you happen to spare a drink of water?" Sarah quickly stepped aside. "Of course." She filled a tin cup from the water bucket, while the stranger accepted it with grateful hands. He drank slowly, careful not to waste a single drop. Only then did his eyes drift toward the table where Noah sat beside the lone bowl of stew. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "If I had more, I'd offer you something to eat." The old cowboy glanced from the pot to the little boy. There was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding. A gentle smile appeared beneath his silver mustache. "Feed your son first," he said quietly. The simple words settled over the room more deeply than any sermon. Sarah noticed then how thin the old man's hands were, how tired his shoulders looked, and how carefully he stood, as though exhaustion had become an old companion. He was plainly hungry, perhaps hungrier than either of them, but he never once looked at the food with longing. Instead, he nodded toward Noah. A growing boy needs his strength. Noah slowly pushed the bowl across the table. "You can have half, mister." The cowboy's eyes softened. "That's mighty kind of you, son." He gently pushed the bowl back. "But kindness isn't measured by how much we take. Sometimes it's measured by what we're willing to leave for someone else." Silence filled the little cabin. Outside, the wind rustled through the cottonwoods while sunlight slipped across the porch. Sarah felt tears threaten to appear. Not because the stranger had refused the meal, but because his words carried the quiet dignity of a man who had endured hardship without letting it harden his heart. "I wish I had something to repay your kindness," she admitted. "You already have," the cowboy replied. "You offered water without asking who I was." He introduced himself simply. Elias Turner. Sarah shared her name, and Noah proudly shook the old cowboy's hand. For a few peaceful minutes, they spoke about the changing weather, the promise of spring grass, and the long cattle trails that stretched across Colorado. Elias never complained, never asked for shelter, never hinted that he expected anything more than the drink of water he had received. At last, he settled his weathered hat back onto his head and lifted his saddlebags. "I'd best be moving along," he said with a grateful smile. Sarah and Noah walked him onto the porch, watching the old cowboy step into the bright morning. He took only a few slow strides across the yard. Then, before leaving, Elias notices something on the ranch that makes him suddenly stop walking. Elias stood perfectly still in the middle of the yard, his weathered eyes fixed on something beyond the leaning split-rail fence. We follow his gaze across the ranch until we notice it too, a line of broken fence posts stretching toward the western pasture, their rails scattered by winter storms. Beyond them, a small cattle gate hung crooked on a single rusted hinge, swaying gently in the spring breeze. Sarah stepped off the porch. "Is something wrong?" The old cowboy answered without taking his eyes from the pasture. "No, ma'am. Just seeing a ranch that still wants to live." Sarah looked across the same ground she had walked every day for months. All she saw were repairs she could no longer afford, and chores she no longer had the strength to finish alone. "It doesn't feel that way anymore," she admitted quietly. Elias gave a faint smile. Land has a way of speaking. Most folks stop listening. The next morning, Sarah awoke before sunrise and quietly opened the front door. She expected to find the yard empty. Instead, she heard the steady rhythm of a hammer echoing through the crisp mountain air. Tap, tap, tap. She hurried toward the western fence. There was Elias. His faded coat lay folded over a fence post while he worked in his denim shirt, driving salvaged nails into old rails with careful, practiced hands. Though his movements were slower than those of a younger cowboy, every swing of the hammer carried decades of experience. "Elias!" Sarah called. "What are you doing?" He looked over his shoulder with an easy smile. "Figured these fences deserved another chance." "You don't owe us anything." "No," he replied. "But sometimes helping is easier than walking away." Before Sarah could protest again, Noah came running across the yard. "Can I help?" The old cowboy handed him a handful of nails. "You surely can." For the rest of the morning, the three of them worked together beneath a bright Colorado sky. Noah proudly gathered loose rails while Sarah held the posts steady. Elias patiently showed the boy how to straighten bent nails instead of throwing them away. "Waste less," he told Noah. "Out here, little things keep families alive." By afternoon, an entire stretch of fence stood strong again. Sarah wiped the sweat from her forehead. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," Elias answered. "You reminded me what home feels like." Those words lingered in Sarah's heart long after the work was finished. That evening, as they shared fresh biscuits Sarah had managed to bake from the last of her flour, Elias noticed an old family photograph resting on the fireplace mantel. He carefully picked it up. The picture showed Sarah standing beside a smiling cowboy whose arm rested proudly around her shoulders. Elias stared at the photograph much longer than expected. "That's my husband," Sarah said softly. "Daniel Collins." The old cowboy's eyes widened with quiet recognition. "Daniel." He gently brushed a thumb across the edge of the picture. "I rode cattle with him nearly 30 years ago." Sarah looked at him in disbelief. "You knew Daniel? Knew him?" Elias chuckled warmly. "He once pulled me out of an icy river during a spring cattle drive. Said no trail partner gets left behind." For the first time since Daniel's passing, Sarah heard someone tell a story about the man she loved that she had never heard before. They laughed together as Elias described Daniel's stubborn courage, his honest heart, and the way he could calm even the wildest horse with nothing more than patience. Noah listened with shining eyes, hearing new pieces of his father's life. But the peaceful evening was broken by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A polished bay horse stopped outside the ranch house. Silas Mercer. The wealthy rancher dismounted confidently, brushing dust from his expensive coat before walking toward the porch. "Mrs. Collins," he called smoothly, "I've come to make one final offer for this property. You know this ranch can't survive another season." Sarah stood a little straighter. "We're not selling." Silas's smile faded as his eyes drifted toward Elias. "And who might this be?" "Just an old cowboy passing through," Elias answered calmly. Silas studied him for a long moment. Elias returned the stare without saying another word, quietly watching every expression that crossed the wealthy rancher's face. Mercer finally tipped his hat with a forced smile before turning back toward his horse. "We'll speak again soon." As the hoofbeats disappeared down the trail, Elias remained silent. Only after the dust settled did he walk to his worn saddlebags resting beside the porch. He slowly loosened the leather straps, reached deep inside, and carefully removed a weathered envelope addressed to Sarah. The old envelope rested quietly in Sarah's trembling hands as the evening sun painted long golden shadows across the porch. We could almost feel the weight of the years sealed inside its weathered paper. Elias Turner stood silently beside the railing, saying nothing. Some moments are too sacred for interruption. Noah looked up at his mother. "Who is it from?" Sarah swallowed hard. The faded handwriting across the front stopped her breath. Mrs. Sarah Collins. Beneath it, in smaller letters she would have recognized anywhere, was a familiar signature. Daniel Collins. Her fingers shook so badly she could scarcely break the old wax seal. "I thought," she whispered, "I thought I'd read every letter Daniel ever wrote." Elias removed his hat. "He asked me to deliver that, if anything ever happened to him. Life carried me farther down the trail than I planned, and by the time I returned, I couldn't find your ranch. I've carried that promise for years." Sarah carefully unfolded the yellowed pages. The first line blurred through her tears. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer beside you. But if the Lord has granted these words to reach your hands, then perhaps He is also sending the help you'll need." She paused, wiping her eyes before continuing. "Never let anyone persuade you to sell this ranch, no matter how difficult life becomes." Sarah exchanged a puzzled glance with Elias. Daniel continued. "Years ago, while repairing the western boundary fence, I discovered something no survey ever recorded. Beyond the western ridge lies a hidden spring that flows year-round. Just past it is a wide meadow with the richest grazing grass I've ever seen. I kept the discovery quiet because I feared wealthy cattlemen would try to claim it before our family could protect it." Sarah's heart pounded. Noah leaned closer. "What does it mean, Mama?" She read the next lines aloud. "The spring is marked beneath an old cottonwood scarred by lightning. Count 20 paces north, then follow the narrow deer trail through the rocks. The valley will reveal itself." The porch fell silent. Elias slowly smiled. "I remember Daniel talking about riding farther west than anyone else during fence repairs. I never knew what he'd found." Sarah folded the letter against her chest. All at once, the pieces began fitting together. Silas Mercer, his repeated offers, his growing impatience, his insistence that the ranch was worthless. "He knew," Sarah whispered. Elias nodded slowly. "Maybe not everything, but enough to believe your land was worth far more than he wanted you to know." Sarah looked toward the western hills, where the fading sunlight painted the ridges gold. "For months," she said quietly, "I believed he was trying to help me escape my troubles." The old cowboy gently shook his head. "No, ma'am. Men like Mercer don't chase worthless land." The following morning, Sarah, Noah, and Elias rode into town carrying the precious letter inside a leather satchel. There was one man Sarah trusted to tell her the truth. Sheriff Nathan Briggs welcomed them into his modest office beside the courthouse. "What brings you folks in today?" he asked. Sarah carefully laid the letter upon his desk. "I need to know if this handwriting is truly my husband's." The sheriff adjusted his spectacles and read every line without speaking. Afterward, he unlocked a cabinet and removed several old county records signed by Daniel Collins years earlier. One by one, he compared every signature, every flourish, every carefully formed letter. Finally, he looked up with complete certainty. "This is genuine." Sarah released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Sheriff Briggs continued, "I'd stake my badge on it. Daniel Collins wrote this letter." Hope, long buried beneath grief and hardship, quietly returned to Sarah's heart. She thanked the sheriff, carefully folded the pages, and slipped them safely back into the envelope. As they stepped outside into the bright Colorado sunshine, Noah reached for her hand. "What do we do now?" Sarah looked toward the distant western ridge rising beyond the valley. For the first time since Daniel's passing, she no longer saw a future filled only with survival. She saw possibility. She saw the promise her husband had protected for their family. She smiled through tears. "We keep this ranch." Elias tipped his hat with quiet pride. "I believe Daniel would be smiling right about now." Sarah straightened her shoulders with a confidence she had not felt in many months. The fear that had haunted every sleepless night was gone, replaced by determination rooted as deeply as the mountains around them. She would honor her husband's trust. She would protect Noah's future. And she would never surrender the home they had built together. Silas arrives with legal papers, unaware Sarah already knows the truth. Silas Mercer climbed onto Sarah Collins' porch with the confidence of a man who believed victory was already his. We could almost hear the rustle of the legal papers tucked beneath his arm as he smiled toward the weary widow, certain that hardship had finally cornered her. But he did not know that everything had changed before the sun had risen. "Mrs. Collins," he said smoothly, unfolding the documents. "I've brought the purchase agreement. Sign today, and you'll have enough money to start over somewhere else." Sarah looked calmly at the papers, but made no move to take them. "I'm not selling." Silas blinked. "I don't think you understand your situation." "I understand it better than I ever have." His smile disappeared. "This ranch won't survive." Sarah met his eyes without fear. "It will." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Silas's voice grew sharper. "You'll regret turning down this offer." Before Sarah could answer, another horse approached the ranch. Sheriff Nathan Briggs dismounted first, followed by Judge Eleanor Hastings, who had agreed to inspect the matter after reviewing Daniel Collins' letter and the county's original property records. Judge Hastings greeted everyone politely before turning to Sarah. "Mrs. Collins, I've examined the deeds, the surveys, and your late husband's documents. There is no question that this ranch, including the Western Ridge and everything beyond it, belongs entirely to your family." Silas stepped forward. "That land has never been properly developed." "Perhaps not," the judge replied evenly. "But undeveloped land is not abandoned land. Ownership has never changed." Sheriff Briggs folded his arms. "The records are clear." Silas realized the opportunity he had quietly pursued for months had slipped away. His shoulders sank. Without another argument, he gathered his papers, climbed onto his horse, and rode down the valley road, never once looking back. A peaceful silence settled over the ranch. The very next morning, Sarah, Noah, Elias, Sheriff Briggs, and a few neighbors followed Daniel's directions beyond the Western Ridge. They found the old cottonwood tree scarred by lightning exactly where the letter had described. 20 careful paces north led them to a narrow deer trail hidden between rocky outcrops. Then the valley opened before them. Crystal clear water poured from a natural spring that had flowed unseen for generations. Around it stretched a broad meadow covered in thick, healthy grass, swaying beneath the Colorado breeze. Noah laughed with delight as he ran across the field. "We found it!" Sarah fell to her knees beside the spring, cupping the cool water in her hands. Tears mixed with joyful laughter, as she realized Daniel's final gift had never been money. It had been hope. That summer, everything began to change. The spring watered new pastures. Healthy cattle returned to the ranch. Fresh vegetables grew beside the farmhouse, and the once empty barn slowly filled again. Neighbors who had once feared Sarah would lose everything now came to celebrate her remarkable recovery. Yet through every blessing, Sarah remembered the hungry cowboy who had first knocked on her door, asking only for a drink of water. One quiet morning, Elias saddled his horse before sunrise. Sarah noticed him tightening the saddle straps. "You're leaving?" He smiled gently. "The trail has been my home for a mighty long time." Noah hurried from the house. "But you just found us." "But you just found us." Elias rested a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder. "And I'll always be grateful for that." Sarah stepped closer. "You gave us far more than a letter. You gave us back our future." The old cowboy lowered his eyes. "I only kept a promise." Sarah shook her head. "No. You reminded us what kindness looks like." She reached into the house and returned carrying a small iron key. "It doesn't open much," she said with a smile. "Just the front door." Elias looked at her in confusion. "This ranch will always have a room waiting for you," Sarah continued. "You never have to ask permission to come home." Noah wrapped his arms around the old cowboy. "You're family now." For a long moment, Elias could not speak. The lonely miles he had traveled, the promises he had carried, and the years spent believing he belonged nowhere suddenly gave way to something he thought he had lost forever. He had found a home. Before we close today's story, thank you for spending this journey with us. If this tale touched your heart, please subscribe, leave a like, and share it with someone who believes kindness still has the power to change lives. We'd love to have you join us for more unforgettable stories from the American frontier. Many years later, Noah stood beside that same spring with his own children playing in the meadow. They asked him how their family had managed to keep the ranch through such difficult times. He smiled as he looked toward the old farmhouse, where an extra room was still lovingly known as Elias's room. Then he told them the lesson that had shaped his entire life. The greatest meal we ever shared was the one a hungry stranger refused to eat.